tuning in today to Front Porch Conversations here at Advent Christian Village. We're on the porch near the river, and it's a beautiful morning here and cool and pleasant. So I want to introduce you to our guest, Barbara White. Barbara, thank you so much for joining us.
Very glad to be here with you today.
Barbara, tell our viewers where you were born and a little bit about your early childhood and life.
Well, I was born in Key West, Florida in 1930 and lived there for the first 5 years of my life. When it was Depression time, my father moved to New England to search for work. And I lived in Springfield, Massachusetts. And then when I was about 8 years old, we moved to Holyoke, Massachusetts. And then when I was in fourth grade, we moved to Pennsylvania until I was in high school, when we moved back to Massachusetts. After graduating from high school, I went into nurses training, and after 3 years, I was working for 5 years when I found the Lord, and went back to Bible college.
Where did you do your nursing training?
In Holyoke, Massachusetts.
Well, Barbara, I have interviewed now about 60 members for these conversations, and very few of us are born in Florida. I interviewed a few weeks ago. We had a conversation here on the porch, and both of them were born in Florida. So what brought your family to Key West in that era? Had they been there for generations, or?
No, my immediate ancestors, my grandparents, migrated from the Bahamas. My mother was actually born in Nassau. I think they came over, it was during the time when the Navy Yard was flourishing. I think they came over for work.
Well, I've known very few people ever born in Key West, so I'm glad to know that that's a contact for you.
It's rather a unique place to be born.
And it's a very unique place anyway. And I know you have a sister. Do you have other siblings?
I have a brother living in Louisiana.
And tell us who your sister is. She lives here at the village, correct?
She lives here. My sister, Charlene Hart.
And she lives in?
Willow Bend Way.
Willow Bend Way, and you live in Carter House, correct?
I live in Carter House.
Barbara, how long have you been here at the village?
Since '09.
And what made you know you wanted to come to the village?
Well, I was an Advent Christian missionary in India, so I've known about the village for a long time. Every furlough, I would come down and visit here and speak to the ladies in the WH and FM. So I was quite familiar with the area. And when Mary and Damon and I retired, the Eastern region fixed up a cottage for us to live on the Plainville Advent Christian Campground. And when Marion died, I was left alone there in the cottage, so I decided to move down here.
And Marion had been your ministry partner?
Yes,
as a missionary
in India.
Well, let's go back a little back in history, though. After you completed your nursing training, you worked in the field of nursing?
Pardon?
Did you work in the field of nursing after you completed?
Oh, yes. I worked in the maternity hospital in Springfield, Massachusetts for 5 years.
And then where did you go to Bible college?
New England School of Theology. I was in the last class that graduated from there before they moved out to Berkshire.
After graduation from there, what was your next path?
My next path was to go to what they called a missionary internship in Detroit. So I worked with the Detroit church for a year under the missionary internship. And then I went to the Summer Institute of Linguistics that Wycliffe provides. I went to Toronto for that for a month. And in September of 1959, I flew to India.
Was India the place you wanted to go as a missionary, or do you felt called to go there?
That was the place the Lord sent me.
At that time, could you enter as being a missionary, or did you have to enter some other way as being a nurse? Or
I had went as a nurse, but I had an actual what they called a residential visa. So I could stay for, we were required then to renew that visa every year. But while we were permitted to be what they called a bona fide citizen. And you just go and renew your permission every year.
So you didn't have to come back to the States?
I didn't have to come back to the States. We did come back once in 5 years for furlough.
Where did you live when you got to India?
When I came back here?
No, when you got to India.
When I got to India, I lived in Guindy. It was on the, in what is now called Chennai. Mm-hmm. In those days, it was still Madras. It's a big port city in the southern part of India on the Bay of Bengal.
And were you there the whole time you were in India?
That was my base.
Uh-huh.
The latter years from 1983 on, we lived in the mountain range of Kodaikanal.
So that was a much more rural
300
area.
miles south of Chennai.
So that was in a rural area, or?
In the mountains, yeah. Yeah.
Now, when you went to India, did most people speak English?
No.
I didn't think so.
So I spent the first full year in language study. The second year was part-time language study, part-time work.
What does the Indian language, is it derived from something that we would be sort of familiar with, or?
Well, in India, every state has its own language.
Well, that's right, I remember that.
They're trying to nationalize Hindi, but most of the states have their own, and English might be a second or third that they would study if they went on to higher education. But I spoke Tamil.
And do you still?
Yeah, yes. I lost my fluency, but I speak.
And you probably don't have a lot of people to speak to.
There's no one to converse with.
What was the biggest adjustment when you arrived in India?
When I arrived in India?
Personally.
Oh, I think my biggest adjustment was to find out that I had a proper bed to sleep in and a house to live in.
You did have one or didn't?
I did.
Oh, and you weren't expecting that?
I wasn't expecting it. The last picture that I had seen of a group of missionaries, they all kind of looked like their clothes were hanging loosely off of them. They looked like they were starved and very sad. And in those days, they didn't smile for a photo. So everybody looked kind of sad. And I wondered what kind of living they had. All the pictures that I had seen of India, they had mud huts and thatched roofs. So I didn't quite know what to expect. And then Marion Damon came home on furlough. And I met her when she came home. And she was a good, chunky lady. I thought to myself, well, if she managed to find something to eat, so can I. And so I think that was probably my greatest surprise when I arrived there.
Did it take you long to gain the trust of people that you interacted with?
Well,
not missionaries, but others.
No, it was a blessing that I had a lot of missionaries that had already been there, so they knew what to expect from a missionary. I didn't have any problems that way.
And when you were talking about going to language training and working part-time, were you working in a hospital or in a...
No, I was living in the house, and the pundit, the teacher, came every day during the week and had an hour's class with me.
And did you work as a nurse there?
Not until the second year. There was
Okay.
no work the first year, just language study. So what I did was I took one of the boarding girls that were living on the compound at the time, and I worked with her, and there was an old-fashioned wire recorder in the house, so I had her record speech for me. And then I would listen to that during the daytime for pronunciation and familiarity. And so I spent most of my time in language.
When you said that's where God called you to go, how did you know that God was calling you?
Oh, that was, well, and when I gave my life to the Lord, it wasn't long after that He called me. By the verse, you have not chosen me, but I have chosen you and ordained you to go and bring forth fruit that would remain. So I knew the Lord wanted me to go. I didn't know where, and I didn't hardly know what a missionary was. I was going to go as a missionary's helper. Nobody had ever heard of such a thing, but that's what I thought that the Lord was calling me to. And then as I grew along and learned more, I discovered I had to go to Bible college before I could even think of going to a mission field, so I had to go to Bible college and get my degree there. And while I was there, I applied for to be a missionary, but at the time we had the organizations were still separated. We had a missionary board for the Philippines and Japan, and another one for India. Well, I thought I'd like to go to the Philippines. And so I went, I applied at the American Advent Mission to go to the Philippines. During a mission conference that we had there in the college, the Lord said to me, you know, you haven't really made a full application. You didn't apply for India yet. So I went and I applied for India. And I still didn't know that that's where the Lord wanted me to go. But 2 missionaries had come home on furlough one day, and I went to meet them at the mission office. And while I was there, news was arrived at the mission office that another applicant for India had been rejected. And just before that, the Warners had been rejected. And before that, another couple had been rejected. And I left that office, and I was walking home that day, and all of a sudden, the tears just started to pour down my face. And my response, without me knowing what was coming out, I said, Lord, why is it that all these worthy people have been rejected and you're going to let me get into India? That was it. I knew.
And you didn't even know you were going to be saying that prayer, right?
No.
I think the Holy Spirit speaks a lot through us, doesn't he?
Oh, yes.
And the Warners, was that Austin Warner and his
yes.
wife?
So they finally went to Japan.
Uh-huh.
They were accepted there. But they had applied for India first.
I find it so fascinating with the people I've had front porch conversations with, how many paths have crossed or almost crossed during the years of their lives.
Actually, the Warners came to visit us in India before they retired.
Oh, really?
Mm. Yeah.
And then he and his wife came here to live, and you reconnected.
Yeah.
Barbara, let's go back a minute to your childhood and tell us a little bit about your sister and your brother and growing up. Fond memories?
Well, we moved around a lot from place to place. In 12 years of schooling, I went to 11 different schools.
Oh, my goodness.
So that was quite an adjustment. But I think it was the Lord's preparation. Mm-hmm. I love to travel. I love to meet other people and new cultures and get involved in other people's lives. So I think the Lord was preparing me for that. When I was just a child, I don't remember too much, but I do remember loving all the different places that we lived in and meeting all the different people.
And then your sister came here to live a while after you moved in, right?
About 2 years after I came. Oh, and we were just delighted. This was just the Lord's gift to each other, because we had not been able to see each other or spend very much time together all the time that I was in India. I'd see her for maybe a couple of days to a week once in 5 years.
So you've had some time to catch up.
Yes.
And to spend this time of your lives here together. That's wonderful.
Oh, so we just feel blessed that we have each other here.
Barbara, would you mind sharing what brought you to faith?
What brought me to faith?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think in the beginning, I was in high school, and somebody introduced me to the books written by Grace Livingston Hill. And she was a Christian novelist. You may not be familiar with her.
I'm not familiar with it.
And she wrote very interesting novels, but they were all. But in them, she would have somebody that was introduced to the Lord. And it was just very interesting one day. I had read many of her books, but in this particular book, there was a girl who led a friend to the Lord. And I just wanted this kind of life. And I got down on my knees and I asked the Lord to come into my heart. But I knew nothing. I had no Bible. I wasn't going to a Bible preaching church. I had no one to guide me or anything. But I knew after I had done that I belonged to the Lord. And I believed that He just led me all my life through that experience. And then when I was working in Springfield, Massachusetts, I was living alone in a boarding house, and I wanted to meet some new friends. And all the friends that I had been meeting, I didn't really want that lifestyle. Mm-hmm. And so I remembered Grace Livingston Hill, and I thought to myself, well, like, the best place to find some good friends will be in a church. I was working nights in the hospital that I worked. I worked the 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. So I was looking for a church that had an evening service. I looked in the newspaper, and just 2 blocks away from me was an Advent Christian church with an evening service. I said, well, we'll just walk down and try it. I got down to the end of the road, and at the end of the road, where the road divided, on the right was the Nazarene church, on the left was the Advent Christian church. And I looked at both of them, and I thought, which one will I go? Well, the Advent Christian church was in the newspaper, so I'll go there. So
that's a good reminder that churches should.
Pardon?
That's a good reminder to churches that they should make themselves known.
Make themselves known. You never know when there's a hungry soul looking for something. Yeah.
Would you share more with us about your time in India?
What would you like to know?
I don't even know what to ask you.
I don't know where to begin, except it was the most wonderful time of my life. The country was a hard place to live in, but the work was I just loved it. My first years until 1983, when we went up in the mountains, I did nursing work. I worked in the dispensaries that we had in Velachery. It was an open dispensary, and the villagers could come. There was no medical supply other than that anywhere in the area. And during the week, I would take our mobile dispensary, the Helen Kinney mobile dispensary, and go out to the villages and visit the people in the villages that had no access to any kind of medical help, and visit the school children and look them over and give them treatment for various things that were troubling them. And I worked with the Bible women, and then I became, for a number of years, what India calls the correspondent of schools. We had 15 schools at the time.
Oh my goodness.
And I was given the bulk of the schools to look after. And the correspondent was kind of a liaison between the government and the management. And so I did that work for a number of years. For a number of years I was the secretary. I couldn't type and I couldn't take shorthand, but I was the secretary. Keeping all the minutes of our meetings. I managed the drivers and the budgets in the compound, on Guindy compound where I was living. And later, after Joy Hollis retired, math was always my worst subject in school, but I became the mission treasurer. You just become a jack of all trades when you're on the mission field. You do what's necessary at the time.
When you were living out in the mountains, were the people there, they had schools to attend? Or
Yes.
is the schools, okay.
We started the School of Evangelism and planted a church up there. The mountain area that we went to had been vacation area for the missionaries. They would just go up in the summer hot months. But because it was kind of a tourist area and missions from all over India would go up there for their vacations, what happened was that nobody actually evangelized the area. And there were a couple of churches there, but they were connected with the English who had established the school that was international school that was in Cody Connell, and they weren't primarily for the Indian people. Mm-hmm. So that when we went up, we were actually planting a new work in the whole area, and
then training to raise up pastors for those churches.
We called it the School of Evangelism. It was rather a unique way of teaching, because we kept 6 students only, and kept them for the full 4 years before we brought in a new batch of students. So it was a discipling program as well as, and in their last year, part of their last year's program was they had to go out to a village, any village that they had visited during their 2nd and 3rd years that they felt the Lord was calling them to, and actually establish a church before they were ready to graduate. Churches in new, unreached areas where nobody had been.
And so the churches were started by people from that area as well.
Yes.
Natives, not just people coming in from other countries.
No. No, these were our students that graduated and went out and built up the church themselves.
When, how many churches would you say were planted during that time you were there?
About 24, 25.
Oh my goodness. What a legacy that is.
Amen.
Barbara, India was still very active in the caste system at that point, right?
No, not actually. It was written off the books and was taken off the books, but you don't change a culture that fast.
Right.
So that it was pretty practiced in most places.
Was there differences in how you approach people of different caste, or were they in some castes more likely to become involved in a church?
It would depend on the area, but I think one of the most beautiful things was we had a place that we called the Gospel Hall. It was planted right on a bus stop between a triangular section of one of the towns. And people would come in there from everywhere waiting for buses, and they'd stop and listen to the services, and then they'd go on later. And we eventually established a church there. But what was a beautiful thing was it was such a crossroads of people that you would see the wealthy sitting beside a poor washerwoman, something like this. The Lord changes, has no caste in the Lord. And it's a beautiful thing to see them change.
I can imagine.
When they come to the Lord.
It is right here, even in our own communities, when we see that happen.
Yeah.
When you retired from the mission field, is that what it's called? Retiring from the mission field, as far as being a foreign missionary?
What's your question?
When after
I retired,
have you been back to India?
No. But one of our young pastors moved to America with his wife, who came over here as a practitioner, a physical practitioner. Mm-hmm. And he came over here and established a church here in outside of Washington, in Maryland. Uh-huh. And that church has been growing.
So you've been able to stay in touch with them some?
I haven't, not since I moved down here.
Oh, okay.
When we were living in Connecticut, we went back and forth to his church quite often. Call us down for special meetings and so forth.
If you were to be asked by a young person today for some advice, what would you tell them? What advice would you offer?
Seek the Lord while you're young. Follow him, he'll never fail you.
And he led you all over?
Led me all the way of my life, and I have nothing but glory and praise and honor for all that he has done.
Now, do I remember correctly that the Caseys were missionaries in India?
They were there about 12 years of the time that I was there.
I was thinking they were, because they had talked about they wanted to be involved in India and kept not getting the say yes for a while.
Yeah, I lived with them for about a year.
And we've had a front porch conversation as well. So,
Oh, you have?
Yes. What is there anything that surprised you about moving to Advent Christian Village?
Anything that surprised me?
Mm-hmm.
Well, because I was somewhat familiar with it, it wasn't such a surprise.
Mm-hmm.
No, I just think the only thing that amazed me was how active old people are.
Well, good. And you're certainly a great example of that. Not that you're old, because you're not compared to some.
Right.
We all like to compare ourselves to not quite as old as somebody else, I think.
Right.
When is there anything else you'd like to share with us that I haven't asked you?
Well, you've done a pretty good job.
Oh, well, thank you.
I think the one thing that blessed me more than anything was to see the Lord working in India, and how He would manifest Himself to so many people in so many ways. We saw some beautiful things happen there. The Lord just changed people's lives. He set them free from evil spirits. He healed them, healed the sick, and He changed whole families, brought them, their whole lives were changed. We have a wonderful God.
Amen. How have you adjusted living in more of a quarantine time here during the last few months?
Oh, you have to adjust,
Mm-hmm.
but it's a hard one. You miss people. And, I think the one thing I've done more than anything else since I've been under the lockup is call my friends and find out how they are.
I think that's
Talk with them.
Mm-hmm, good for everybody.
Yeah.
And even some of the people on TV that are broadcasting from home, you get the sense that it has impacted people's lives in a lot of ways, but in very positive ones as well.
Well,
And keeping in touch.
You can even let the Lord impact it positively, or you can sit under it and be miserable.
Well, you don't look miserable at all to me.
Oh, I'm not miserable.
And your smile is, whenever I see that, is a great blessing. Thank you so much for sitting down with me and talking today.
Oh, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
And thank you for those of you who've tuned in. I look forward to seeing us on future conversations.